Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into straw sandals and stepping into the wooden halls of feudal Japan, not as a warrior, but as something just as essential and twice as exhausted, a samurai's servant. You might have dreamed of honor, sword fights, and cherry blossoms gently falling onto polished armor. But let's be honest, you're probably going to be elbow deep in laundry water before sunrise. And if you bow 1 second too late, let's just say you'll learn the hard way that etiquette can hurt. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments what city you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your name isn't important, not yet. To the guards at the estate gates, you're just the new one. You arrived with a bundle of second-hand robes, a reed mat for sleeping, and the barest clue of what you just signed up for. Becoming a samurai's servant isn't like applying for a modern job. You don't interview, you endure. Sometimes you're born into the household line, your father polished the same sword you'll polish. Other times, you were sold into service as a child, or handed over by your family in exchange for rice during a famine. There's no union, no salary negotiation, just the hope of not getting kicked too hard your first week. The first order of business? Hair. It's cut, sometimes shaved, to mark your status. You're scrubbed, doused in powdered incense, and issued a faded uniform that might have belonged to someone who died last spring. No one explains much. Instead, you're taught by silence, stares, and getting smacked with a fan when you fold the bedding the wrong way. It's not cruelty, it's tradition, or so they say. The estate is both beautiful and brutal. Paper walls slide open to reveal elegant gardens, koi ponds, and rooms where samurai discuss battle plans over steaming tea. But those same walls let every whisper carry, and there's nowhere to hide when you're the lowest-ranked person in the room. You're always visible. And in this job, visibility is vulnerability. Your first task is humbling. Sweep the outer walkway without making noise. Which sounds simple until you realize the old servant watching you expects the floorboards to creak only once per sweep. The goal is present, but silent, which, coincidentally, is how your entire life will feel for the foreseeable future. The samurai you serve doesn't speak to you at first. His wife might. She might also throw a hairpin if you set her tea tray 1 inch off-center. The older servants give you advice you didn't ask for and test you by leaving hot kettles too close to the edge of tables. It's like a hazing ritual, except it never really ends. Still, there's a strange rhythm to it all. You begin to learn which footsteps mean anger and which mean hunger. You memorize the timing of bells, the sound of rain on the roof tiles, and the exact placement of your master's shoes. You learn to bow deeply, speak softly, and vanish before you're noticed. And here's the twist. Despite all the exhaustion and uncertainty, you begin to take pride in your tasks. You iron pleats with hot stones, wipe down armor until it shines like moonlight on a still pond, and learn the proper way to fold a letter in 6 creases. No more, no less. Historians still debate just how much autonomy samurai servants truly had. Some say the role was more dynamic than we think, offering chances to rise, to be entrusted with secrets or even tasks of political importance. Others argue it was strict, thankless, and almost monastic. The truth is likely in between, like so much of history, layered, nuanced, and full of contradictions. But tonight, none of that matters. Tonight, you're just trying not to spill a bucket of wash water on your master's imported tatami mat. Dawn comes early, and in the samurai household, so do you. Before the first rooster crows, you're already moving through shadowy corridors, careful not to rattle the rice paper doors. Your job. Light the lanterns. Then the incense. Then the coals in the hearths. Yes, with real fire. You fumble with flint and steel, praying you don't set your sleeve on fire or, worse, produce smoke that wakes your master an hour too early. The kitchen is your second battlefield. It's still dark outside, and yet the rice must be soaking, the miso stirred, and the fish gutted before the sun even thinks of rising. The cook is a terrifying woman with arms like a lumberjack and a memory sharper than any katana. You once misplaced the salt, and she still brings it up every time she passes you, usually with a smug, "Don't forget the sea's flavor this time, little one." You chop vegetables in silence. Every sound, from the thud of the knife to the hiss of the boiling pot, is part of a delicate musical piece, and you're expected to know the rhythm. Mess it up, and someone may enter just to scowl at you. That someone might be the steward, who doesn't like new servants and likes them even less when they ask questions. Like, why is the pickled plum jar hidden behind the rice sacks? Or, why do we feed the cat before the second bell? Some things, apparently, you're just supposed to know. After breakfast is prepared, you help deliver it on lacquered trays. No fingerprints. No spills. And definitely no eye contact with your master unless spoken to. The samurai family eats in near silence, which is how you know the meal is acceptable. If a single throat clears, that's panic. You bow out, heart pounding, and rush back to the kitchen to figure out what went wrong. Was it the daikon? The tea temperature? Was the rice 2 grains too firm? Then come the chores. Washing armor, airing robes, arranging sandals, sweeping gravel paths. Yes, even the gravel must be pretty. But here's a surprise. One of your duties is to maintain the sword rack. You don't touch the blades, of course. That's sacred. But you dust the rack, keep it symmetrical, and place offerings nearby during certain festivals. Some believe this brings protection to the house. Others say it's just superstition. Historians still debate whether these rituals were truly spiritual or just aesthetic traditions passed down like heirloom ceramics. And then there's the matter of watching. You're always watching your master's mood, watching for out-of-place objects, watching for the moment to step forward with a towel or step back into the shadows. You become fluent in silence, in gestures, in side glances exchanged across tatami floors. But your reward for a perfectly executed morning? Lunch, which you don't eat until every other breathing soul in the household is full. It's not glamorous, but it's oddly comforting. A bowl of rice, a few pickles, and sometimes, if the cook is feeling generous, a leftover dumpling that didn't quite pass presentation standards. By now, your feet ache and your sleeves smell faintly of charcoal and soy. But you've made it through half the day without getting scolded, slapped, or reassigned to stable duty. In this line of work, that's basically a gold star. Some historians suggest that life as a servant could offer rare upward mobility. Trusted aides occasionally rose to become advisors or even warriors in their own right. But others argue that such cases were exceptional, romanticized by later storytellers. The reality: you're too busy hauling buckets and folding robes to worry about legacy. You sip warm barley tea behind the kitchen door, stealing a moment of peace. Outside, the wind rustles the bamboo. Inside, the bells chime for afternoon duty. Break's over. The afternoon hits differently. The house is quieter, and yet somehow, your duties get heavier. After your short lunch, yes, the one you inhaled in 3 bites while crouched by a storeroom, you're summoned for maintenance tasks. That's a broad term that really just means anything and everything the samurai doesn't want to think about, but absolutely needs done. First up, polishing. Not just floors, but swords, armor stands, even the occasional bronze mirror. And no, you're not allowed to leave streaks. You kneel for what feels like hours, rubbing each surface with cloths made from worn-out silks, trying not to sneeze from the dust. Your knees go numb, your back aches, and if a hair falls onto the lacquered chest you're wiping, start over. There's a reason older servants walk with a slight tilt. It's from years of bowing and buffing. Then it's time for errands. You sprint to the market for soy, dash back with the carpenter's repair notice, and try not to drop anything, especially if it's wrapped in ceremonial cloth. You have no money of your own, only the pouch tied to your belt, and you've been warned, twice, not to lose a single mon coin. Not because they don't trust you. Okay, fine, it's because they don't trust you. They say 1 lost coin brings 7 days of bad luck. And someone will probably make you reenact all 7. When you return, you're directed toward the garden. And here's the thing, medieval samurai gardens aren't just pretty. They're deliberate, symbolic, and extremely picky. You rake gravel into patterns that are supposed to resemble waves or mountains. Does it look like a child did it with a broom? Start over. Are the stepping stones crooked? Fix them, even if it means lifting each one with your bare hands. Some historians claim this obsessive order reflected the samurai's need for mental clarity. Others argue it was just a fancy way to keep servants like you constantly busy. By mid-afternoon, you're pulled into wardrobe duty. You've never feared a kimono until now. Folding one correctly takes both geometry and divination. Is the left side over the right? Good. Is the fold lying flat and perfectly angled? Excellent. Did you breathe too loudly while the master tried it on? You'll hear about it later. The worst part. You never get to wear one yourself. Your robe is brown, plain, and smells faintly of pickled radish, no matter how many times you wash it. Then comes the tea. Not drinking it, preparing it. And this isn't your run-of-the-mill tea bag dunk. You're whisking powdered matcha in a ceramic bowl with the precision of a monk painting mandalas. Every motion matters. The placement of the bowl, the tilt of your hands, even the way you bow as you offer it. The tea ritual is quiet, slow, almost meditative. You'd enjoy it if you weren't worried about spilling even a single drop. You might think this kind of ceremony would be calming. It's not. Your mind races. Did you put the sword stand back in the right corner? Did you forget to relight the incense in the hallway alcove? Is the master's nephew visiting tomorrow? If so, that means more cleaning. And pretending you're invisible. Still, there are strange, lovely moments. A crane landing in the courtyard. The soft hiss of water over stones. The warmth of the tea bowl against your palms, just for a moment, before you hand it off. You exist in the background, but the rhythm of the day begins to feel like a dance. A quiet, complicated, exhausting dance you never get applause for. There's a rumor among the staff that the master once promoted a servant who poured tea with such grace. A visiting monk wept. But some say that monk was drunk, and the promotion never happened. Scholars still argue whether such stories reflect real upward mobility or were just morale-boosting myths whispered during dish duty. Either way, you're not counting on promotions. You're just trying not to trip over your own sleeves. The sun is dipping lower now. Shadows stretch across the tatami. Someone rings the bell for evening preparations. No rest yet. Dusk in the samurai household is a quiet kind of chaos. It's when everything has to be perfect, but nobody wants to look like they're trying too hard. You, of course, are trying very hard, because you're the one behind the illusion of effortless grace. The lamps need to be lit, the floors swept one last time, and the master's favorite cushion fluffed to just the right degree of plumpness. And heaven help you if a single tatami mat is out of alignment. That's the kind of aesthetic crime that could haunt your dreams. Dinner is imminent. You won't be eating it, at least not the good parts. Your job is to prep it, serve it, and clean up afterward, like a backstage ninja of cuisine. The kitchen, a separate structure behind the main house, is dim and smoky, lit by oil lamps and the soft glow of embers. You help the cook arrange the meal, rice polished until it gleams, seasonal pickles, and maybe grilled fish if the master's in a generous mood. There's no fridge, of course. Everything is fresh, or at least pretending to be. You carry the tray into the main hall, stepping softly, head bowed. You kneel, present the dishes in a specific order, rice in front, soup to the right, pickles in the back, and wait in silence. You don't speak unless spoken to. If the master nods, you bow and leave. If the master frowns, you wait to see which minor misstep you'll get blamed for. Was the rice too firm? The chopsticks too plain? Some say samurai learned their manners from Zen monks. Others argue they just enjoyed making their staff sweat. Once the master begins to eat, you return to the corridor, listening for the sound of the bowls. When you're finally allowed to eat, it's backstage leftovers. Not always bad, but rarely warm. Sometimes it's the rice crust scraped from the pot, sometimes a few pickled plums no one wanted. If you're lucky, you might sneak a bite of fish skin. It's not about taste, it's about fuel. Afterward, there's more tea. Always more tea. If guests are visiting, it turns into an extended performance. Tea, poetry, maybe a demonstration of sword technique if someone's in the mood. You hover like a ghost in the background, pouring and clearing with the grace of someone who has practiced hundreds of times. And if the guest compliments the tea, the master takes credit. Naturally, you might think the day is winding down. It's not. You still have evening duties, closing shutters, stoking braziers, laying out the futon. Some households use mosquito nets, others don't. If your master's the paranoid type, you may be ordered to sleep just outside their door. For protection, they say, though your weapon is basically a broom handle. The night air smells like burnt ash and old wood. You roll out the futon in perfect lines, smoothing every wrinkle. You light one last stick of incense and place it in the niche behind the master's head. The fragrance is supposed to bring calm dreams. You're hoping it works on your own nightmare about Ms. folding the robe again. Some historians debate how much autonomy samurai servants really had. Were you a slave? An employee? A family retainer with hidden influence? The answer probably shifts depending on the decade and who's writing the scroll. All you know is that you're not free to leave, not free to speak your mind, and definitely not free to skip polishing the sword if you're too tired. Freedom, in this job, looks like 5 minutes sitting alone by the well after everyone's gone to sleep. Finally, you retreat to your quarters, more like a corner behind a storage rack. No mattress, just straw. No blanket, just your robe. Your eyes burn from smoke, your knees throb from kneeling, and your fingers smell like fish scales and incense. You lie there, breathing slow, hoping no one needs you before sunrise. You did everything right today, or at least, no one yelled. That's a win. And tomorrow, you'll do it all again. At the crack of dawn, you're already awake. Not because you're a morning person. Oh no, but because the rooster your lord imported from the countryside has a personal vendetta against you. It starts crowing before the sun has even considered rising, and once it starts, you might as well give up on sleep. Besides, there's charcoal to be lit, chamber pots to be discreetly handled, and floors that mysteriously redust themselves every single night. You step out into the cool morning air, clutching your bundle of chores like a samurai grips his katana, except yours is made of laundry, firewood, and the occasional dead rat. Breakfast won't cook itself, and your master is very particular about his miso soup. Not too salty, not too bland, and certainly not reheated. You learn fast that a grumpy samurai is worse than a sword-wielding one, especially before he's had his rice. And here's where your job gets delicate. You aren't just a cook or a cleaner. You're also expected to be a reader of moods. Is your master sharpening his sword in a contemplative way, or in a somebody's about to be fired way? Is his silence peaceful or ominous? You serve the morning meal and retreat just far enough to be invisible, but close enough to respond instantly if summoned. The goal is to blend in with the architecture. After breakfast, you assist with dressing. Now, you might think samurai could dress themselves, and technically they can. But it's a performance, especially if they expect visitors or are heading to court. Layered robes, stiff collars, proper creases. It's a fashion puzzle wrapped in etiquette, wrapped in potential humiliation if you get it wrong. Your master raises his arms slightly, and you swoop in like a well-trained hawk, folding sleeves, tying cords, straightening hems. Some say the ritual of dressing reflects inner discipline. Others say it's just a fancy way to make servants sweat. Once the dressing is done, you hand over the sword. Yes, that sword. The one you spent hours oiling last night until it gleamed like moonlight on water. Presenting the katana is practically its own ceremony. Blade up, both hands, silent bow. If you even breathe on the blade, better hope you have a backup job in rice farming. Today, the master has a meeting at the local magistrate's estate. You accompany him, walking several paces behind, carrying an umbrella in case the weather shifts. On the way, you nod politely to every passerby while mentally calculating how long it will take to polish his sandals when you return. Spoiler: longer than it should. At the magistrate's place, you wait outside with the other servants. It's like a backstage green room, except there's no tea, the gossip is about taxes, and everyone's side-eyeing each other's robes to see who works for someone important. Sometimes, these moments feel almost restful, until someone mentions the possibility of surprise inspections back home, and your blood pressure goes straight through your top knot. When you get back, your master removes his sandals at the gen can and tosses you a look that says, "I expect tea in 5 minutes or less." You sprint to the kitchen, avoiding the resident dog who seems to hate you specifically, and prepare the tray. Tea, sweets, a seasonal leaf for aesthetic balance. Because even snacks are a philosophical statement in this house. And just when you think the day might be slowing down, you're asked to write a letter on behalf of your master. That's right, you're also a scribe. Not officially, of course, but he doesn't trust anyone else to get the phrasing just right. You kneel, brush in hand, and copy down his dictated words with a precision that could rival a monk's. If he changes his mind halfway through the letter, and he always does, you start over. Some historians suggest samurai servants were more educated than we assume. Many were trained in reading, writing, even poetry. Others argue this was rare and mostly limited to elite households. You, personally, are just proud you managed to use the word honor 3 times in one sentence without it sounding weird. By evening, your master praises your tea. Quietly. Which is like getting a standing ovation. You nod, bow, and feel your soul inflate half an inch. Then you return to your chores, because the lanterns won't light themselves and the guest bedding needs airing. The day ends with you scrubbing soot from the fire pit while humming a song your grandmother taught you. You're bone-tired, your knees ache, and your hands are stained with ink and soy sauce. But you did good. You served well. And tomorrow, it all begins again, with or without eyebrows. Your samurai master has many weapons. Some are sharp, some are ceremonial, and at least one has a name that's probably more intimidating than the blade itself. But what he really needs sharpened most days. His reputation. And you, yes you, are part of that polish job. Because while samurai may fight with swords, they live and die by status, and a servant's clumsiness can tarnish a master's honor faster than spilled sake. Today, you're headed to a festival in the village. Which sounds fun, right? You imagine lanterns, rice cakes, music. But no. You're there as part of the entourage, meaning your job is to look alert, keep the master's path clear, and carry everything from his second pair of sandals to the gift-wrapped fan he'll hand to someone of marginal importance. All without tripping over your own geta. You arrive early to help set up. That's a rule of thumb in your world. If something starts at noon, you start preparing at dawn. You've got to scout the path, make sure there are no puddles for the master's robes to drag through, and quietly bribe the local children not to throw stones when they get bored. 1 copper coin and a smile usually does it. 2 if they've got slingshots. Once the master arrives, you shift into what can only be described as ceremonial invisibility. You hover. You anticipate. You catch a teacup before it hits the ground. You make sure his sleeves don't dip into the soup. You laugh just loud enough at the magistrate's bad jokes to show your master's social grace, but not so loud that you become the center of attention. And then there are the rival servants. Oh yes, you've got competition. One of them, let's call him Taro, works for a minor lord who insists on carrying a folding screen everywhere. Taro is smug, overly precise, and has never once let his master's sash fall out of line. You nod politely when your paths cross, but inside, it's a full-on mental martial arts tournament. You will out-host, out-bow, and out-tea this man if it's the last thing you do. At one point, your master steps aside to admire a scroll. It's beautiful, ink on silk, poetry and brushwork in harmony. He nods slightly. That means, you'll be writing something better tonight to hang in my study. And so, mentally, you start composing haiku about moonlight and muddy shoes. A major moment comes when your master is invited to the sake tasting. This is high stakes. If he drinks too much, you may have to carry him home. If he drinks too little, it's rude. You carefully watch how much is poured and signal a discreet "no more" with the flick of a fan. You're also on high alert for any attempts at poisoning, unlikely, but not unheard of. One servant once dipped his own chopsticks into his master's bowl first. He lived. Barely. Scholars still debate the role of servants in courtly diplomacy. Some argue you were silent tools. Others believe you shaped political outcomes through the smallest of gestures. You personally think both are true. After all, a misplaced sandal or an untied sash can insult the wrong person and spiral into a scandal. By late afternoon, the festival ends. You help your master onto the palanquin, which he rides back home in style. You, however, walk. In the rain. Uphill. Both ways. Back home, you change into your night clothes, still formal, just slightly less starch. You prepare his bath, complete with scented herbs, and lay out fresh towels folded just so. He doesn't say thank you. He nods. Which, to be fair, is practically a standing ovation in samurai language. Finally, after seeing to the lanterns, locking the gate, and making sure the dog hasn't stolen tomorrow's breakfast, you settle into your own corner of the estate. It's not a room. It's more of a large drawer. But it's yours. And as you close your eyes, your last thought is, tomorrow, Taro is going down. Before the sun even bothers to rise, you're already up, because today is sparring day. And while it might sound like only the samurai swing swords around dramatically, you, the humble servant, have your own kind of battlefield to prep. The dojo floor needs to be spotless, the bamboo practice swords sanded and laid out just so, and the water bucket positioned where your master can rinse his face without dripping on his ceremonial robe. There's a rhythm to this morning, and you're its quiet drummer. You're not fighting, of course. You're polishing. You're folding. You're wiping sweat that isn't even yours. But don't underestimate your role. If a servant places the wrong gloves with the wrong training gear, someone's pride could suffer, and nothing's more dangerous than an embarrassed samurai with a bruised ego. Scholars still debate whether one lost duel in 1582 was caused by a mismatched belt. No one wants to take that risk again. Today, your master is training with another clan's heir. It's one of those we're friends but secretly hate each other kind of arrangements. They bow respectfully, but their eyes scream, I hope I make you bleed. You watch from the sidelines, pretending to arrange towels, but really, you're watching for tells, a faltering stance, a heavy breath. You'll report anything significant later, not because you're a tattletale, but because information is power, and your master expects it. The training match begins, and the dojo fills with the rhythmic crack of bamboo on bamboo. You flinch instinctively, even though you're well out of range. That's how you know you've been here too long. One of your jobs is to swap out split practice swords before they become dangerous, so you hover near the weapon stand like a ghostly armorer. At some point, your master calls for water. You kneel, holding the dipper just low enough not to spill, just high enough not to make him bend. The angle is critical. One slip and the dojo master will scold you in haiku. As sparring intensifies, the mood shifts. It's not just training anymore, it's pride. You feel it in the silence between hits, the slight growl in your master's breath. And you know what that means. You'll be up tonight polishing armor for a duel that isn't technically a duel, just a matter of honor. Right. Then, the opponent slips. Not much, just a half step too wide. But your master sees it and takes the point. There's a bow, a smile, and an exchange of polite, deadly words you pretend not to hear. They both sheath their swords. The training match is over. The real competition has only just begun. Afterward, you help your master remove his gear. His robe is damp with sweat, and you fold it carefully, as if the fabric might bite. You help him wash up, standing by with a towel, a change of clothes, and a comment that's just flattering enough to be heard, but humble enough to avoid suspicion. Later, you're tasked with bringing tea to the other clan's retinue. You bow, smile, and offer it gracefully. Inside, you're scanning the room. Who's whispering? Who's looking smug? Who's pretending to not notice you while clearly noticing everything you do? Being a servant means being invisible, but also being everywhere. That night, you sit down to write your report. Not an official one, just notes you'll remember if asked. The heir's stance has a weakness to the left. He favors the right wrist. His servant spilled tea, which means they're either careless or stressed. These are the breadcrumbs of survival in a world where information travels in whispers and bows. You fall asleep wondering if your master will challenge the heir to something soon. A duel, a poem, a contest of go, it doesn't matter. You'll be the one preparing the board, sharpening the brush, or checking the blade. Because being a samurai's servant means being ready for war, even when all you're technically holding is a tray. Your master's afternoon plans are, as always, subject to the whims of power. Today, it's a visit to the lord of the province, a daimyo known for his impressive mustache and unpredictable temper. Which means, of course, you're polishing sandals. Yes, sandals. Because while the samurai code may preach simplicity and humility, it does not tolerate dusty footwear in front of high-ranking nobles. You kneel outside the chamber with the other retainers, cradling your master's zori in your lap like they're the imperial regalia. You've buffed the lacquer, realigned the straw cords, even fluffed the interior with a bit of folded silk. Presentation is everything. One wrinkle and it's an insult. Two wrinkles and it's seppuku-level drama. The lord's estate is a palace of whispering floors and sliding paper walls, and you step silently behind your master, eyes lowered. Your job is to be invisible, but not so invisible that you can't be summoned instantly for tea, scrolls, or a very specific pillow with the clan crest perfectly centered. While the nobles discuss matters of taxes, territory, and poetic metaphors for betrayal, you're busy tracking social landmines. The other servants are watching too, some with curiosity, some with quiet competitiveness. Servants gossip, and gossip travels faster than arrows. One of the other retainers casually bumps your shoulder near the tea table. Not hard. Just enough to say, "We see you, outsider." You respond with the most dangerous weapon in your arsenal. Perfect posture. During a lull in the conversation, your master signals for his ink set. You spring into motion, presenting it with a bow that's timed to the exact length of a breath. Not too fast, not too slow. He uncaps the brush, composes a brief haiku, and hands it to the lord, who chuckles politely. You, meanwhile, discreetly catch a glimpse of the calligraphy. It's good. Really good. Which means your master's in favor today. For now. After the meeting, your duties shift to what's known as face-saving logistics. That is, escorting your master out of the room with just enough reverence that it elevates him above the other guests, but without making the lord feel overshadowed. It's a delicate dance, and one wrong step could be social suicide. Fortunately, you've practiced this exact routine on rice sacks in the storehouse. Back home, your master is pleased. He doesn't say it, of course. But he grunts less when you help him remove his outer robe, and he doesn't correct your tea preparation, which is the equivalent of high praise in samurai culture. Later that night, you join the other servants in the back quarters. Someone brought pickled radish. Someone else snuck in sake. You all sit in a circle, swapping stories in low voices. One servant tells of how he accidentally stepped on a noble's dog and lived. Another brags about folding a robe so perfectly it brought a tear to his master's eye. Though, to be fair, it could have been dust. Then someone asks about you. So, how's life with Lord Stiff Shoulders? You shrug, because a good servant never betrays a master's secrets. But inside, you're proud. You handled the sandals. You timed the bow. You read the brushstroke. You were, for one silent, strategic afternoon, the quiet shadow behind the samurai's rise. History rarely remembers servants by name. Scholars still debate whether the brushwork of certain lords was actually improved by whispered suggestions from the back of the room. But in your world, a half smile from your master is enough. You helped him win today. That's more than most warriors can say. You wake before dawn to the rhythmic clack of bamboo. It's the signal for morning kata, the daily martial drill your master never skips, even if he has a fever, a limp, or an upset stomach from too much fermented soy. You've got maybe 2 minutes to get his training gear ready before he storms out in full warrior mode, hair tied up like he's marching to battle, not the courtyard. The wooden practice swords, bakken, are heavy, nicked, and carry the faint smell of yesterday's sweat. You've already wiped them down with oil and sanded the grips smooth, because splinters can sour a morning faster than a bad omen. You're also hauling out the straw training dummy, affectionately named Sir Useless by the other servants. You drag him to the center of the courtyard, straighten him up, and step back. Your master appears, barefoot and expressionless. He nods at you, and you bow so deep your nose brushes your knees. Then he begins, swings, stances, and cuts that seem almost effortless. But you know better. You've watched him train through pain, through rain, even once during a minor earthquake. You also know when he's off by half a breath. Which means you get to quietly adjust the target angle, refill the water gourd, and catch the practice blade before it crashes into the garden lantern again. As he drills, you keep time with your inner metronome. 1, 2, pivot. 1, 2, strike. You've heard these movements described as art, as poetry, as a sacred dance between death and discipline. But when you're the one hauling around the armor chest or relacing the grips, it feels a little less poetic and a lot more sweaty. After an hour, your master gestures. It's time for sparring. But not with you, yet. Today, one of the younger samurai is visiting for joint practice, and your job is to act as both referee and damage control committee. You lay out the spare bokken, mop up the sweat patches, and make a mental note of which sword has the less obvious crack in the handle. The sparring starts civil. 2 warriors circling like cats with expensive haircuts. But after a few exchanges, tempers flare. The clangs get louder, the footwork sharper. Then, snap. The cracked bokken breaks. Not cleanly. Your heart stops. The visiting samurai's hand is bleeding. It's shallow, but you can already see the problem. Someone's going to get blamed. You're on it in 2 steps, already holding the emergency bandage cloth. You press it into the guest's palm, bow so low you nearly vanish, and mutter something about faultless tools failing even the sharpest eyes. Your master glares. Not at the guest, at the sword rack. He won't say it, but you know you've just saved his pride. After the courtyard clears, your master finally speaks. That won't happen again, he mutters. And you, knowing he means both the broken sword and the near insult, simply nod. Historians might write about famous duels, about battlefield tactics and legendary blades. But they often forget the invisible hands behind the warrior, the servant who caught the sword, who cleaned the wound, who fixed the training gear before it even looked broken. You're that hand. And every morning, before the first swing, you're already in motion. Your master's armor is beautiful in the way that thunder is beautiful, loud, inevitable, and capable of crushing someone if mishandled. Today, it's your job to make sure every lacquered plate, silk tie, and iron clasp is ready for his ceremonial inspection, and that means hauling out the full Yoroi set before the sun fully crests the garden wall. It takes nearly an hour just to unpack it. Each piece rests in its own wooden box lined with soft cloth. The do, or chest armor, gleams a deep indigo with gold detailing, signs of your master's rank. The sodi, or shoulder guards, rattle when lifted. They're heavier than you remembered. Maybe you're just tired, or maybe your arms haven't quite recovered from yesterday's sparring dummy incident. Dressing your master in armor is not unlike building a small, determined fortress out of one angry man. There's an order to it: ko-sewed underlayers, shiitake tunic, high-date thigh guards, and so on. Miss one step, and everything shifts. If the shoulder plates pinch or the shin guards slip mid-battle, guess who gets blamed? Hint, it's not the guy holding the sword. You kneel and begin the dance. Ties over knots, folds against folds. The armor smells faintly of camellia oil, with undertones of smoke, leather, and the occasional panic sweat. Your master doesn't speak as you work. That's usually a good sign. You double-check every clasp and lace, making sure nothing will rattle during his walk through the estate. A noble samurai should sound like silence, not a tin can full of rice. And then, it's the helmet. The kabuto. You lift it carefully. It's a dramatic thing, with a crest shaped like horns and a faceplate that could scare off hungry ghosts. But it's also absurdly heavy, and it needs to rest just so on his head. You slide it on, adjust the straps, and hold your breath. He nods. You live. The ceremony itself is brief, but your work continues in the background. You're straightening creases, brushing off specks of dust, and ensuring that his sandals don't betray him on the slippery stone path. Once he's finished bowing to elders and not smiling at junior retainers, you're there to catch the armor pieces as he sheds them like a molting beetle. But here's the strange part: even after all this care, this armor may never see battle. Most samurai spend more time in ceremony than in combat. Historians write about famous duels and bloody wars, but much of your day involves maintaining armor that might never need to block an arrow. It's theater. Necessary theater, sure, but theater nonetheless. There's one piece that never fits quite right: his left kote, the armored sleeve. You've modified it twice now, adding padding and adjusting the cords. And still, he grunts when it goes on. This again, he mutters. You make a mental note to restitch it later. Quietly. Without asking. That's the job, really. Reading the silences, fixing the unseen, and making sure your master looks like a demigod when he walks out the door. Even if you're the one holding his forgotten sword behind him. You wake to the sound of clanging, again. The courtyard is already humming with the sound of bamboo swords cracking against each other. Today is training day, and while your master's apprentices are getting their egos bruised, you're expected to manage the chaos behind the scenes. First task: find the lost Bakken. Someone, probably Tetsuya, the clumsy one, left it under the plum tree yesterday, and it's now camouflaged under fallen petals. You find it just as your master calls for it, his voice calm but edged like a freshly sharpened blade. You jog over, present it with both hands, and step back before he starts a demonstration that will leave at least one apprentice limping. As a samurai's servant, your relationship with weapons is a weird one. You're not supposed to use them, unless in emergencies, but you must know them, clean them, and treat them like sacred objects. The bakken, the katana, the wakizashi, each has its ritual. You oil the blades with camellia oil, check for hairline cracks in the hilts, and whisper apologies if you drop one. Today's sparring is fierce. Sweat and pride fly in equal measure. Your master barely moves, just enough to humiliate. It's less a lesson in swordplay and more a masterclass in restraint. You keep a towel tucked under your belt, ready to offer it when he nods. Which he does, once, after defeating 3 boys with what looks like a lazy flick of the wrist. Then it's time for lunch. You carry the tray: rice, pickled plum, and a tiny side of dried squid. No, it's not much. Samurai culture prizes simplicity, at least in theory. In practice, your master complains if the rice isn't fluffy. You've learned how to fan the lid of the pot just long enough for steam to settle, but not enough to dry it out. It's practically magic. But here's a fun fact: many samurai couldn't cook to save their lives. That was your job. Or the kitchen boy's job. Or sometimes, the job of an old woman who smelled like miso and gossip. Either way, your master assumes food just appears. He never asks how. While he eats, you polish the practice blades. You overhear one apprentice grumbling about the bruises forming on his wrist. Another complains about his sandals. You silently wonder if they even realize how easy they have it. They spar. You scrub. They bleed a little. You bleed metaphorically every time someone forgets to thank you. And then, just as you're about to sit for a moment, you hear it. Where is the calligraphy brush? Oh no. The ink practice was scheduled for tomorrow, but someone, maybe the steward, maybe the household cat, has rearranged the calendar. Now you're sprinting through the house looking for the special badger hair brush your master likes, the one that lives in a sandalwood box beneath a different box that lives beneath his poetry scrolls. You find it. Just in time. He doesn't thank you. He just uncaps the ink and begins to write. Later, after sunset, you kneel by the fire pit cleaning a blade by moonlight. Someone passes you a rice ball. You don't ask who. You just eat it, grateful that today, no one lost an eye. Historians still debate how much agency samurai servants had. Were you simply tools? Or low-ranking warriors in training? There's no clear consensus. All you know is that without you, this entire operation would collapse faster than a bamboo door in a typhoon. You're up before the crows. Again. The air outside is damp, the kind that creeps into your joints and makes your knees feel like they're 90 years old even though you're probably only 17. Today is not sword practice or poetry recitation. Today is, brace yourself, armor day. Yes, the full set. Lacquered plates, shoulder guards, and that awkward helmet that looks like it was designed by someone who hated necks. You drag the wooden chest across the floor with all the subtlety of a landslide and begin unpacking. One piece at a time. Chest plate, thigh guards, forearm wraps. Each section gets wiped with a cloth soaked in oil to protect it from rust and the indignity of sweat stains. Samurai armor isn't just protection, it's status. Every decorative knot and layered scale says something about your master's rank and his taste in warfare. That crimson lacquered shoulder piece? Imported dye. That fine chainmail stitched into silk? Probably cost more than your yearly food budget. And it's your job to maintain it like it's sacred. Because, well, it kind of is. By the time your master appears, hair tied and face unreadable, you've laid everything out in perfect order. He nods once. The ritual begins. You help strap on the kote, those stiff forearm protectors, and then the do, the cuirass that wraps around his torso like a fancy turtle shell. You have to tighten the cords without pinching skin. Or pulling hair. You did that once, and he didn't talk to you for 2 days. While dressing him, you listen. Samurai rarely speak casually, but if you're lucky, he might mutter something useful. Like which clan is visiting next. Or which cousin has fallen out of favor. Information is currency, and you're the quiet little banker. The most terrifying part? The kabuto, the helmet. Not because it's heavy, though it is, but because it changes him. Once that crested thing is on his head, he's no longer your sleepy, poetry-writing, sandal-forgetting master. He becomes a symbol. A warrior. You've seen even the boldest retainers flinch under that gaze. He heads to the training yard for a mock battle. You trail behind like a shadow with a towel, water, and emergency sewing kit. Yes, really. Armor straps snap more often than you'd think. Today's mock opponent is a friend from another domain. This means formality levels are maxed out. You bow a lot. You fetch a lot. You smile without showing teeth, just as you were taught. It's an exhausting dance of, yes, my lord, and, as you wish, while making sure no one trips over the ornamental koi pond. And when the bout is over, your master wins, of course. You're there to catch the discarded armor like a medieval coat rack. Each piece goes back into its place. Each knot gets loosened just so. You clean the sweat off the interior of the helmet while he sips barley tea, never once commenting on the fact that the armor weighs more than you do. Scholars still argue whether armor maintenance was always the servant's job or whether some warriors took pride in doing it themselves. Honestly, you hope they did. Because after a full day of lifting metal, you feel less like a person and more like a blacksmith's overworked apprentice with a bad back. You return the armor to its chest. Wipe down the floor. Light some incense, because the whole room now smells like a wet dog in a bell tower. And as you settle into your straw mat at the edge of the room, feet aching, fingers blistered, you realize one thing. The armor may be his, but the weight of keeping it perfect is all yours. You're awakened by the soft hiss of a sliding door and the unmistakable clink of ceramic cups. Today, you're attending your master on a social visit, an outing to another samurai's estate. You might think this would be a break. It isn't. It's more like performance art with consequences. First up, you prep his travel outfit. Not the battle gear today, but the formal silk kimono with the family crest stitched so meticulously it looks hand-painted. You smooth it out with care and shake your head at the irony. You can barely afford rice, and yet you're folding fabric worth more than your entire life. You ready his sandals, pack his ink set, he always likes to impress with spontaneous haiku, and brush his horse until it gleams. No, you don't ride, you walk alongside. Always just behind, just out of frame, like a particularly anxious shadow. The estate you visit belongs to a samurai of equal or slightly higher rank. That means more bowing, more waiting in corridors where your knees go numb on the tatami mat, and more tea, always tea. Your job is to make sure your master looks good without ever being seen. You anticipate his needs before he even knows he has them. Hand him a fan before he's hot, adjust his sleeve before it slips, refill his tea before it's empty. During the conversation, you observe silently. Topics shift from poetry to politics, from swordsmith gossip to who insulted whose ancestors last week. This is where the game is played, not on battlefields, but with sharp smiles and veiled insults. And sometimes, you're the one who gets sent outside for air, which usually means to eavesdrop. That's a risky business. You crouch behind paper screens and pretend to tend a garden, straining to catch names and phrases. Once, you misheard a critical name and nearly caused a family feud. Lesson learned: memorize the clan charts better. Lunch is served. You don't eat with the group, of course. You're handed a modest bento and told to sit quietly in the servants' alcove. But, honestly, you're grateful. It's the one time you don't have to be alert. You chew slowly, savoring the pickled radish like it's ambrosia. After the visit, you help your master back into his sandals. You bow to every post and pebble on your way out. The return trip is quiet. Your master might reflect aloud, but he's mostly watching the horizon. And you, well, you're replaying every word of the meeting in your mind, trying to decide which bits were important enough to write in the evening report. Back home, you help him disrobe. You hang up the kimono in a cedar-lined chest, then clean the ink set, which he never used because he spent the whole afternoon talking about carp breeding. Historians still debate how much influence samurai servants actually had. Some believe they were mere background characters, others think they were the unofficial advisors behind the scenes. You're not sure where you fall on that argument, but you do know that without you, your master would have shown up today in mismatched socks and a haiku about frogs no one wanted to hear. And that has to count for something. You're barely finished wiping the dust from your master's geta sandals before another bell rings, this time summoning you to the weapons room. It's polishing day, which, to the untrained ear, sounds almost serene. You, however, know it means hours of delicate work, hunched over steel that could ruin you with a single slip. The katana isn't just a weapon, it's the soul of the samurai, or so they say. And by extension, it's now your sacred duty to make sure that soul doesn't look like it was dragged through a rice paddy. You set out the uchiko powder, cotton cloths, choji oil, and start with reverent precision. Your hands move with a muscle memory carved from repetition and mild fear. You've seen a fellow servant get dismissed for scratching a blade's curve. He now sells fish in a village whose name no one remembers. While your master lounges in another room sipping tea, you polish. The sword glints in the light, its Hammond pattern shimmering like ripples in moonlight. You focus harder. Even breathing too close to it might leave a foggy smear, an offense punishable by an immediate and humiliating scolding, if not worse. You pause briefly to stretch your back and accidentally knock over a rag. The clang echoes. Your heart stops. But no shout follows. Not this time. Once the katana is done, there's still the wakizashi and tanto. The smaller blades are trickier, not because they're harder to clean, but because their owners tend to forget where they last left them. You once found one jammed into a beam after a drinking party. Another time, it was tucked in a sandal box. You handled both with the careful respect of someone handling live snakes. Then come the fittings, cleaning the tsuba, handguard, the rayskin hilt, the lacquered scabbard. There's artistry in it all, but also drudgery. No one praises a perfectly polished blade. But a single blemish? That becomes the talk of the house for a week. You wonder sometimes if samurai ever do this themselves. You've heard stories of warriors who personally cared for their swords like sacred relics. But your master? He's more of a display it on the wall and talk about it at dinner kind of man. Still, you don't mind. There's something meditative about it, rubbing the cloth in small circles, seeing your reflection slowly emerge in the steel. It's like looking into the eye of a storm that you're not allowed to touch. Academic circles still debate how often samurai personally maintained their weapons versus delegating the task. Some scrolls suggest it was a point of pride, others imply that was just for show, and servants like you were the real caretakers. You can't say for sure, but you do know this. When your master parades that katana during festivals, the compliments he receives belong, just a little bit, to you too. You finish with a final wipe and place the sword back on its rack with the delicacy of a priest laying a relic on an altar. Your hands smell faintly of metal and oil. Your back aches. But when your master walks in, inspects the blade with a single glance, and simply nods, you take it as the highest praise in the world. The day winds down, but your duties don't. Just when you think you might get a moment to slip away for a cup of barley tea, your name is called again. Tonight, your master is hosting a guest. That means prepping the room, setting out the tatami cushions just right, and, most crucially, presenting the food. You're not the cook, of course. That job belongs to someone with calloused hands and deep knowledge of miso ratios. But you are the runner, the hands that carry trays from the kitchen to the inner room, silent as a breeze. Every dish must be presented with elegance. The bowls must not rattle. The sashimi must shimmer. And the pickled radish must never, ever touch the rice. You kneel outside the shoji screen and wait for a pause in conversation. When it comes, you slide open the door with the practiced grace of someone who's done it 100 times. You bow low, place the tray, and retreat backward like a crab trained in court etiquette. The meal itself is uneventful, though you can't help but overhear snippets, talk of another clan's rising power, speculation about a storm off the coast. You know you shouldn't listen. But servants hear everything. You don't speak of it, though. That's part of the unwritten code. Loose lips don't just sink ships, they get reassigned to latrine duty. After dinner, the guest departs with polite farewells and a hint of sake on his breath. You begin the cleanup, folding cloths, stacking bowls, and sweeping away invisible specks. The house must look like it hasn't just entertained a warlord and his entourage. Like nothing happened at all. As you wash the lacquerware, your reflection glints back at you. Tired eyes, soot-smudged collar, and all. You're not proud, exactly. But there's a strange satisfaction in knowing the night went smoothly, that your master's honor remains intact in the eyes of his peers. And yes, the leftovers weren't bad either. You finally retreat to your corner of the servant quarters. It's barely larger than a rice bin, but it's yours. You sit, stretch your aching legs, and chew on a sweet potato that someone in the kitchen slipped you. Outside, the crickets have started their nightly concert. The moon hangs like a paper lantern above the tiled roof. And you, after all the kneeling, the scrubbing, the dodging, the polishing, you've made it through another day. Historians still puzzle over the emotional lives of samurai servants. Did they find joy in their work? Did they feel resentment? Gratitude? The records are thin. Most scrolls focus on their masters, as if the servants were mere background noise. But you know better. You were there, in the corners of those great halls, making the stories possible. One polished sword, one perfect rice bowl at a time. And now, the lamps are dim. The tatami is cool beneath you. Somewhere far away, the faint creak of a floorboard settles into silence. Your muscles have finally stopped aching. You lie back, gazing up at the timbered ceiling, wondering how many servants before you looked up at the same beams, thinking the same quiet thoughts. You feel the ghost of heat from the day's forge, the echo of clinking dishes, and the rustle of silk robes as your master passed by. It's all distant now, soft, like a memory drifting off on a river of sleep. No more hurried footsteps, no more bowing or whispered orders. Just the slow, rhythmic breath of the night, the gentle hush of the wind threading through bamboo. The world is still, and for the first time today you are too. Sleep comes not as a command, but as a kindness. Good night, gentle traveler.